Hello, everybody. I hope that you had a good spring break, at least to settle into your new digs and prepare for just wrapping up the semester. We really don't have too much left, which is a relief because this online stuff is a struggle, I know. So thanks for bearing with me, and we'll all try and just get through the last few bits together. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about typography, which is about fonts and the prints that you use on your map and the different words and labels that you have to explain what's going on your map. So first, we'll just touch real quickly on what we've got coming up. So, today's April 6th. We'll work on typography. Next class, we've got a discussion about how GIS is used to, early GIS techniques, thinking about where things happen in space, has been really important for learning about the world, not just describing the world, but learning new things about it. And so we'll talk about disease again. We'll talk about John Snow's discovery of disease in drinking water and really the early understanding of germs. So I know some of you struggled wrapping up Lab 9. I will be happy to accept a substitute map, a Google map, if y'all can't finish up the GPS maps. So check in with me if you need some help with Lab 9. I'll be in office hours during our lab time, as well as during my office hours. So I'll have Zoom open this week. And then Lab 10 is our final lab. We're going to get rid of Lab 11 and 12. So Lab 10 is a choice for you to make, and if you go into Brightspace, you'll see some options there for you to choose from, doing a map on ArcGIS or doing a map with Google. Next week, we'll do an exam review, and then you'll have a week to complete exam 2 online, where you can use your notes and just covering the stuff we've gone over since the last exam. And then the week after that, you'll just have time to finish up your final project. So have a look at the instructions for that. It's really kind of a reflection of you putting together the maps that you've created and putting them into a booklet, or an online version into a PDF with some reflection. Then that'll be it. The final projects will be due the last week of class, and there will be no final for this class, just the last exam 2. So we got rid of an exam as well as the last 2 labs. So make sure and have a look at the updated syllabus, the grade book, so you can see what points there are, and let me know if you have questions so that we can finish up this semester and be done with it. Okay, so we've already discussed visual hierarchy and talked about it quite a bit. And we know that if you're successful with your visual hierarchy, that the reader's eye will go to the most important things first, that they will jump out, and that things that are less important, that that are secondary to the map, then will kind of fade into the background a bit, because you can't have everything big and bold on the map, right? You need to have some things come first, some things come second or third. And so, we can see this map here on the bottom shows us the difference between the left and the right, where successful visual hierarchy helps you see what's going on, sees the title first, right? The title should always be biggest, boldest, kind of the first thing you look at to know if you really want to engage the map at all. And then you can see there's visual hierarchy both with the coloring of the topography being shaded, with the lake being a different color than topography, different symbology for the different types of roads, but also the fonts are different, right? And we haven't so much talked about specifically font, and that's what we'll talk about today, right? So got a big bold title, then the legend has where it's got the circle with the bodies found, that's a smaller font. Then you've got specific fonts for creeks and lakes, right? And those are often italicized. And so you can see different font style, different font size that helps you read the map in order of what is important. Right, and so you have to think about font because, right, maps aren't just symbols, that the text is a really important component of, seeing what things are, what matters, what the legend is. That text is a really important component, even though we try and use less text because we can't fill up a whole map with text. We're trying to use images to make things simpler and easier to read. But that doesn't mean the text isn't important too. And the visual hierarchy, of course, applies to font as much as the images. And so it's important to think about, right, the legibility of individual letters, especially if you're using small type sizes, small font sizes, that you don't want to get too creative with your fonts. There's a lot of wild, weird fonts out there. You want to try and keep it simple and easy to read. And you want to, make sure that you're choosing fonts that there's little confusion between the different letters. And that's especially important for I and J. Those can be easily confused in some fonts, as well as C and E. And so making sure that you can read all the letters clearly, especially when you're going into smaller font size. Right, you want to select a typeface with relatively large X height. And so in a few moments, we'll talk about what X height is, right? It's the size of the letters, of the bodies of the letters. And so we'll look at the different names for how we define fonts and different letter parts. As well as then, right, you need to think about the width of the letters, how far they are apart from each other. And there's actually quite a bit you can control, not just choosing the font and the size, but you can actually adjust a lot of things within a font. You want to also, right, avoid extremely bold fonts, right? So you can see on the bottom where it says nope, that you can't see the blank space in the letters, right? The circle and the P, the circle in the inside of the O, but you need to be able to see those things clearly in order to read what the letters are. And so, size, boldness, italicize, right? There's lots of different things, as well as transparency, fading backwards and forwards that are going to be really important in designing the fonts on a map, right? And we looked at that map, a bad map a while ago that just had font everywhere, all the same like size and importance, and it was just impossible to read. So getting rid of some of the font is important, but also choosing font carefully. Right, and here's just an example of a pretty standard political map where right there is font all over the place and it's kind of intense, but they have used visual hierarchy to help see, right, the country first. So we see Malaysia and Indonesia as large and purple, right? And they both share the same font type and size and color because they're both countries, right? Whereas then you can see the Java C or the Celebes C. No idea if that's how that's pronounced, right? They're both the same size and color because they're both labeling Cs. So, right, you use similar colors and sizes for representing things that are similar, right? So Timor C. And then you have, large cities have the same symbology, right? The orange dots, but also the same font size and type, right? And then you can see things like the Makassar Strait or the Silet Karamata, these places that the font actually follows the body of water. So instead of just going straight across the screen, for rivers and streams and borders and things, we often see the font actually follow the shape of the thing that it's labeling, right? And there's options within ArcGIS to label things in that way. Right, there's also a lot of standardized labeling within ArcGIS for boundaries, right? They've got a certain font type for boundary for a major road versus a minor road. And you'll see there's also ones for oceans, streams, countries, cities, capital cities versus, villages, things like that. And so there's a bunch of choices in ArcGIS that actually gives you some kind of standardized labeling for different city sizes or oceans versus seas versus streams and stuff like that. And so you'll see there's kind of a standardization in there that you can choose from that'll help you stick with what people might expect for different labels. Right, we also talked about the 5 design principles and how those, right, don't just apply to pictures and symbols, but also apply to font, right? So visual contrast, how much a font stands out, whether it's big and bold or whether it's kind of faded into the background. Legibility, right, choosing a good font, not Old English or something that's super script, looks like handwriting. Those are really hard to read. Figure ground organization, so that's also kind of font size and boldness. Hierarchical organization, right? So you might actually have a map where you need a full paragraph of text on there, but that's probably something that's going to be smaller and further down on the map than, you know, the big bold title. And then finding some kind of balance, both, you know, from across the page, so that it's not too top heavy or bottom heavy. And so trying to get things to be symmetrical, or some way that the text is distributed nicely across the page, right? And so when we think about design principles, we think about how that allows a system across the entire map, so that when you see, you know, the page or the screen when you're looking at a map, there's some kind of system for seeing and understanding the relative importance of the content in the map and on the page. That if you just have everything of equal importance, that nothing is important, right? And so without these design principles, your map isn't going to be able to communicate. All right, so we're going to look at a little bit about text type, text size, how that impacts our hierarchy of text on the page, right? So when we think about hierarchy, it's about getting people to look where we want them to look on the page or the screen, where we want them to look first, second, third, and so on. And that gets emphasized, right, by size, weight, right, whether it's bold or not bold, the color of the text, the style, and the placement on the page, right? So all of those things matter for imagery and text as well. And, you know, kind of an example, right, like we look at bad maps, we can look at bad fonts. With this, this type of map you would see for a ransom note, where someone cuts out a bunch of different, right, every letter is a different font. And so it just creates chaos on the page. It's hard to know where to look, especially the one on the right. The one on the left, you see that larger font that says raggedy. But on the right, you don't know where to look first. I mean, you start at the top to start reading, and it just looks terrible. Right, so that is not effective communication, except if you're writing a ransom note. I don't know if there's a such thing as a ransom map. Right, so the power of, we talked about the power of symbology, but type is also extremely important as well. And so how we use font or type on the page, we can use it to help create chunks of information, right? So putting different text near each other is going to mean they're associated, but also having text that has the same color or the same font or size is going to mean they're related in some way, right? Like we saw all oceans had the same font and text, right? And so that creates a chunk of information, so you know that, okay, these are all different ocean labels. Really complex type can, you know, be more powerful in expressing something that's really important, that's maybe very emotional or very important, like an emergency, right? So you might have big, bold text if something is screaming out to be noticed. That, right, type has ways of organizing information and communicating really effectively if we use it right. And that, right, it helps if we consider contrast, alignment, right? So whether something is flat across the screen or following a border, whether we have different, a repetition of a specific font type, like labeling things similarly, and proximity, right? So actually, if you're using labels, of text next to symbols that, right, you have a dot for the city of New York, you want the font that's labeling that New York City to be fairly close to the label. So proximity is going to matter as well, right? So considering symbology and text together is really important. And sometimes ArcGIS doesn't do a great job of when it's automatically throwing fonts and labels up there, that you have to go in and make adjustments. And you've done that in some of the labs, especially for the flow map with the airports, that you made some adjustments of the symbol and the text so that they weren't overlapping, and so that they were close enough that you knew that they were associated, right? So if we look here on the right, if you have an open circle for symbology, that might be necessary, but it also can look like an O, right? And so on the left, you have Rome labeled, but it looks like Romeo, right? And so just simply shifting that text a bit makes it much more clear that you're labeling Rome, and putting that label up and to the right of the symbol helps make it quite clear. And of course, here on the bottom, having both the symbology, larger and smaller dots, match with the text symbol. So larger font for the larger city and smaller font for the smaller city. So thinking about the placement and the position of the font and the symbols, and then thinking about, right, type, style, right, whether it's indented, whether it's italicized or other stylized fonts, type weight, right, how bolded it is, type size, right, and then actually choosing a font, right. So all these are going to be important components for labeling your map. And you have to consider legibility and readability in choosing both font and its boldness and its size. All these things go into whether it's legible and readable, right? So legibility is a function of typeface design. There's actually a lot that goes in, right? There's a lot of fonts to choose from, and there's a lot of people who think about font very carefully. But designing a font or a typeface, you have to think about the ability to distinguish one letter from another, right? And some fonts are not great at that. You have to think about whether people are going to be reading your map, right, on a page or on the screen. Can the shapes of the text be made out? Is it, are you getting the information across? So legibility, but also then readability, and that can depend on how much text you have, if it's just a label or if it's a paragraph of information or sentences, right? So how easily words, phrases, and blocks of text can be read together, so that the reader can absorb a whole section of information. All right, so here on the right, if you're getting emails that are all caps, usually that's not super comfortable. It usually indicates some kind of yelling. So you'd only want to use all caps if that's what you were trying to get at. It's not as easy to read a chunk of information when it's all in caps, right? It's hard to tell where words stop and start, right? Whereas on the bottom, when you have the proper sentence capitalization, it's easier to get through that chunk of information, right? And so those are things to consider. I don't know if anyone's used the National Weather Service. When they issue weather bulletins, they unfortunately use all text, and it's exhausting to try and read through a whole page of it. It starts to kind of wear on the eyes because you're trying to figure out where you're at in a paragraph, where you're at in a sentence. And so it's really annoying. I think it's a holdover from the old printers they used to use, and their bureaucracy has been slow to change. So they keep this unfortunate weather bulletin that's just screaming at you for a page, and it's exhausting. So don't do that. Use your all caps very sparingly. All right, so for labeling, putting text next to symbols, there's some things to consider that you might have to go in and change individually after ArcGIS adds labels, right? So you want to avoid lettering across boundaries, right? So this image on the left where you have Riverside and Springdale both crossing their county boundaries, how hard it is to read the letters because the black of the county line and the black of the R and river start to blend together. Right, so make sure you move that stuff around so it's more legible. That there's 4 places relative to a point where you can put text, right? So this picture on the right, the 1, 2, 3, 4, that the best choice is number 1, if it's possible, right? So you can see on the image on the left, that's where Riverside is, but that doesn't work. So you might have to choose one of these other points, but it is preferable that if you have a symbol or a dot, that you put the label in the upper right-hand corner. But you can move right to 2 and 3 and 4 after that if that doesn't work. Right, and that points do not have an orientation, unlike a border or a stream. So you would always have the text be right straight across the screen horizontal. Whereas if that was labeling the river, you would normally actually have the label follow the river. Right, so lettering, symbols across lines or areas that you usually have the text follow the orientation, the direction of the line, right? So on the left here, we see Briar Creek and Stone Creek, and the label follows the orientation, and then often is also kind of spread out over it, so the letters are further apart to actually follow a large chunk of the line. Right, that helps you associate that text with that symbology. We can see also the same thing, concerns about where you put the label, the text, along with the symbology for something like typography, right? That on the top, when you've got the 10, 20, 30, that it's hard to tell which line is associated with the 10 or the 20, right? Is it the top line or the bottom line? And so for things, symbols like this, you actually want to put the text right on the line with a break in between it so that you can clearly see that this top line is associated with the number 10, right? Okay, so we're going to talk about parts of type, parts of the letters, which have different names. I don't know why this nice legs is what they've chosen to use, but this is the easiest way to see the way they've got labeled these different letters and groups of letters. So we can see here on the left, right, they've got this yellow line is showing us the height of the capital N letter, right? And that is the cap height, right? The height of the capital letter. So that's an important thing that people think about when they are designing a font and discussing fonts. We can see here way on the other side, on the right, this yellow line after the S is the X height, right? So that's just the height of all the bodies of the letters that aren't capitalized, right? And that's actually one of the most important sizes when thinking about the legibility of text, is that it has a good X height, that it's not too squatty and shrunken down. And so that X height's an important thing that people talk about a lot when they're thinking about font. Okay, so if we start here on the left, we've got the cap height, then the baseline is the line that all the letters sit upon, right? They're not up and down all over the place, that all the lines sit on this, all the letters sit on this baseline. And we don't see it on the page, but we can see that everything's nice and straight. We then see here in the E of the word nice, this yellow area, the blank spot in the E is called the counter, right? The negative space within a letter, whether that's the E, whether it's an O or a P, or even down here the G, it's that empty space. And the empty space is just as important as the dark black letter, the ink on the page. That without a big counter, that when a letter's too bolded or something and you can't see that negative space, it does become really challenging to read. It can be hard to tell the different letters from each other if you don't have a nice counter there, the negative space, right? We can see then the L here has a part that stretches up above the X height, right? It's called the ascender. And not all letters have an ascender. Otherwise, that would be called the X height, right? So it's this part that sticks out above the rest of the letters. And that's countered by then the descender, right? The G or the P or the J that drops down below the baseline, right? And then there's also something called the terminal, which is just the end point of a letter, right? So I think it's useful for you to know some of these terms, particularly the X height and the baseline and the counter are really important things to have a look at. When you look at fonts, you know, probably a lot of people haven't thought too much about font, but if you scroll through some of the options on, you know, ArcGIS or even Word or PowerPoint, you can see there's a lot of different fonts out there. A lot of these vary in height, in, you know, baseline and counter, and so that really changes how legible they are. The last thing then to think about is the set width, which is the, all right, it's pointing it out on the E here, the width of a character in relation to the height, right? So just how, you know, whether it's square, whether it's long and skinny, whether it's short and wide, thinking about set width versus the X height, right? And so these are, in, you know, here I've just taken out all the extra description just so that you can familiarize yourself with some of this terminology. And I want to make sure that you know a couple of these, right? Make sure that you know what a cap height is, that you know what an X height is, right? And a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. So, okay, right? So some things to consider when we think about legibility of font specifically. So what people talk about with is not just like how see-through it is, but that you're not focused on the font, that you're focused on the information you get from the font, right? That you aren't even thinking about how crazy is this font when I'm trying to read, I can't quite read it, that you're just getting the information, that the words are coming into your eyes without any barriers, right? And so that the content should be more important than the container. The typefaces should not call undue attention to themselves. Right, so more legible fonts have large open counters, right? That negative space is really important. That they have ample lowercase x heights, right? That the character shapes that are obvious and easy to recognize. And that, right, that there's some restraint necessary in order to have legible text. So not text that is excessively light or excessively bold. That you know, that the strokes of a font aren't too variable, that they have an appropriate boldness throughout or lightness throughout. And then in just a moment, we're going to talk about serifs, which is just the kind of little extra flourishes on a letter, which can be important and help determine one letter from another, but we want to make sure that serifs aren't too, they don't stand out too much. So spacing, just something to think about depending on how much text you're putting on your map. Single spacing versus, you know, double spacing, that we often have to put quite a bit of information on a map. We're trying to, you know, put all sorts of interesting, you know, informative stuff on a map through symbols and text, and that you don't want to have to cram too much in, that people are still going to have to be able to read that. And so oftentimes adding a little extra spacing makes it easier to read, but it does take up more space on your map. So that's something to consider. All right, so bolding of a text, right, clearly makes something stand out more, that we often have boldness in our titles to indicate that it's more important. And we can see how much that changes the same font, right? So this is the same font, but one is bold and one is not bold. And one thing about boldness is it often decreases the counter, right? So the empty space in the O starts to decrease as we get bolder and bolder. the smaller space, you know, the counter in the A starts to disappear, right? And you can see already that maybe the letter C and the letter O and the letter E start to all kind of blend together. They can start to look pretty similar. And that, you know, excessive boldness can start to look like all caps or something. It starts to become a bit obnoxious in that it's screaming in your face, and that's not always necessary. Okay, where did that go? Right, so you might choose a font, and then there's a whole series of different choices you can make about the font. So I actually happen to like Garamond quite a bit. And you can, once you've chosen a font family like Garamond, then you can make adjustments like how bold it is, you know, whether it's italicized, you know, all sorts of different choices. But sorry, this is a little messed up. That there's, you can see on this top with the Garamond that it has both the main lines, but then it has these little feet on the bottom of the A, whereas below it, the Tahoma does not. It's just very blocky, right? And so these little feet sticking out at the bottom of the A on the Garamond font is called the serif. And so some fonts have a serif and some are called sans serif, which means they don't have those little distinctions. Right, so serif, whether you choose a font that is serif and has those little extra flourishes or not, might depend on whether you're printing your map or whether you're going to be viewing it online. So serifs can be really useful. They're not just, I mean, they're decorative in a lot of ways, but they also can help distinguish between some letters. For example, an uppercase I and a lowercase L, right? That those can look really similar unless they have a little extra flourish on them to tell one from the other. And so serifs are usually pretty useful for printing. If you're printing on a page, it can really help a viewer to read on the page if it has a serif. Whereas often it's recommended that online, if you're viewing a map on a screen, that serifs can start to blur together a bit. Serifs can also be really helpful if you have a larger chunk of information, right? So not if you're labeling, you know, one or two things or choosing a title, but if you need to have a small paragraph of information, that serifs can help move the eye along the sentences and down the paragraph. So it helps kind of connect the letters to each other. Right, so we can see the differences here between a serif, a sans serif, and even a slab serif, which I don't often use unless it's like for a very simple bold label. Right, so the Garamond here has the little feet on the H, whereas the sans doesn't have any of those little flourishes. And then the slab serif has really big, chunky flourishes on the G there. All right, so when we think about type, we have to think about right, the serif, the different strokes, whether it has a good counter, the X height, and we have to think about the size. And so all of this goes into deciding kind of what the font's going to look like on your page, right? So by style, type can be serif, meaning it has those tiny strokes. It can be sans serif with no tiny strokes. We think about size quite a bit, and the type is measured in font size that is called points, right? There's 72 points in an inch, right? And so you'd think about, 12-point font is going to be a fraction of that inch on the screen, right? And so the thing about font size is that it depends on the X heights that have been chosen for that font. And so that you might have a 32-point font in, Arial is going to be actually a different size than 32-point font in Times or 32-point font in Helvetica. So that's something that can be a little frustrating when you're trying to choose different fonts and sizes, is that, right, they're going to be, even though they have the same number, they're going to be different heights. All right, just a couple more things and we'll wrap this up. It's not just the, height of the letters and such that matters, but actually how close the letters are to each other, both, when you're choosing that difference between, the spacing between the lines, but also the spacing between the individual letters themselves. So kerning is something that you can adjust. That's the horizontal spacing between pairs of letters, right? So you can see in Look that if you reduce that kerning way low, you start to have letters that actually overlap each other. But you can also space them out quite a bit, which helps if you're labeling like a creek or a border where you want the letters spread out across that creek. You're going to be increasing the kerning. The leading, right, is the vertical space between lines of text, right? So when I'm asking y'all to turn in essays for classes, that I ask you to do double space, and that's a function of that leading, that vertical spacing between lines of text. You can also adjust the tracking, which is then the horizontal spacing between all characters in a large block of text, as opposed to the pairs of letters that we see above. So you can also stretch out letters along, a border or a creek by adjusting the tracking, and that starts to stretch things out. All right, so just a couple kind of ideas about how to know what is a good text to use. So serif typefaces are recognized for having high readability, whereas sans serif typefaces are known for being clear and legible. So, right, how do you choose? So I usually use serif typefaces when I have a chunk of information like a paragraph, whereas sans serif is really nice for a label or a title or something that's just a short blurb of text, right? Of course, there's research that gives you all sorts of information about what's the best font, but it's not really conclusive, and a lot of it is up to your taste. And you should, just starting to think about what kind of font looks better is the first step is recognizing that different fonts have very different legibility and impacts on the reader. There is, that people have decided that a bold sans serif typeface used in conjunction with kind of a lighter font provides good contrast and good chunking of information. So maybe you have a big, bold sans serif typeface that's giving you a little short chunk of information, and then maybe you have a short paragraph below that of, a lighter serif font. That can help you combine things in a way that helps people read. There's also, and I'm sure y'all are aware of this when you're typing an essay, there's different ways to put your type on the page, whether that's justified, which means the sentence, right, goes from one side of the page to the other, whether it's centered, whether it's flush left or flush right. And, if you're turning in an essay, you want that, the main text to be flush left. I often get essays that are turned in centered. That always confuses me why you would do that. Centered is usually something you use for the title, maybe the author information. Flush right might also be used for having some information on the author or the class. And then justified. Justified can look really cool for certain types of text where it makes everything a nice block. And so, I'm sure y'all know how to do that on Word, but you can also make these adjustments in ArcGIS as well. One final thing to say, that, right, when we have maps, something with a lot of images and colors and symbols, and we're trying to introduce text, that can be really busy and challenging and hard to read, right? Especially if you have a lot of color and you're trying to put text over the top. that it's hard to find a good text color that's going to contrast with all the colors in the background, right? So this, right, text across the image of a butterfly makes it really challenging, and I wouldn't even bother, right, reading that text. I'd be so annoyed, I wouldn't want to read it. There are some ways to work around that. I would, just try and think about the placement of your text so that you don't have that type of challenge. If necessary, you can kind of fade some of the colors in the images behind it in the background so that you have the proper contrast to actually read the text over the top. All right, so that's all I have for typography. I do want you to know what the difference between serif and sans serif is. I want you to be able to know what some of the different names are for different, we're talking about text, right? The X height and stuff like that. So we'll also do review next week before the exam, but I have office hours tomorrow and Wednesday, and then I'll have the office hours open for lab on Wednesday as well. Anyways, email me if you have questions as you try and adjust from spring break back into the last couple of weeks of classes. I know it's a challenge, but hopefully we can get this wrapped up. And that's it. Thanks, everybody. Bye.